On the first Tuesday of November, somewhere between $20 and $30 million passes through a single Australian intersection in roughly 200 seconds. That intersection is Flemington Racecourse in Melbourne, and the event is a horse race that has been running almost without interruption since 1861. Most countries have a sporting event that the nation tunes in to watch. Australia is the only country that legally pauses for one. Public holidays are declared in Victoria, schools shut early, courts adjourn, Parliament suspends sitting, and at 3 inches the afternoon Eastern Time, the world's 12th largest economy stops moving so its citizens can watch animals run in a circle for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The official line is that the Melbourne Cup is a cultural tradition. The economic reality is stranger, because somewhere inside the machinery of this race is a mechanism. Peculiar that the Productivity Commission once estimated it generates more recurring economic activity per minute of viewing than any other sporting event on Earth. And the number that proves it, buried in a 2014 Victorian government report most Australians have never heard of. Is the open loop this story is going to pay off at the end? To understand why a horse race stops a country, you have to start with the year 1861. In a Melbourne that had just stopped being a tent city, the Victorian gold rush had pulled roughly 500,000 people into the colony in less than a decade. The resulting population shock had built a city with no civic identity and an enormous amount of speculative cash. The first Melbourne Cup was run on Thursday, the 7th of November that year, in front of about 4,000 spectators. The winning horse, Archer, had reportedly walked over 600 kilometers from Nowra in New South Wales to compete. The prize was 710 gold sovereigns and a hand-beaten gold watch. What is interesting is not the race itself, but what happened around it. By 1877, the Victorian colonial government had declared Cup Day a public half-holiday for public servants. By 1893, it was a full public holiday across metropolitan Melbourne. No other sporting fixture in the British Empire had achieved that status. The reason, according to historian Andrew Lemon's 3-volume history of Australian thoroughbred racing published by Hardy Grant, is that the race was deliberately engineered by the Victoria Racing Club as a unifying civic event in a colony that had no shared institutions, no aristocracy, and no agreed-upon identity. Racing filled the vacuum. By the early 20th century, the Cup had become something stranger than a sporting fixture. It had become the country's largest organized cash flow event outside of payday. And the catch is that cash flow runs almost entirely through a single mechanism that most viewers never think about. That mechanism is the totalisator. Walk into any tab outlet in Australia on Cup Day or open the app. The money you place on a horse is not bet against a bookmaker holding a fixed margin. It is pooled with every other punter's money. The operator skims a fixed percentage off the top, and the remainder is divided among the winners. In Australia, this percentage is called the takeout rate, and on win bets, it sits at around 14.5% for Tabcorp, the listed operator that runs the dominant totalisator network. On exotic bets like trifectas and first 4S, the takeout can climb above 20%. In the 2023 financial year, Tabcorp reported wagering and media revenue of approximately $2.4 billion Australian dollars across its full operations, with the Spring Carnival period contributing a disproportionate share. Melbourne Cup Day alone typically generates between $220 and $250 million in turnover on the single race, according to figures published annually by the company and cross-referenced by Racing Victoria. To put that in scale, that is more money moved through a single sporting wager event than the entire annual revenue of several ASX-listed mid-cap companies combined. It is roughly the same dollar volume that the Australian fresh seafood retail sector turns over in a typical week. But here's where it gets interesting, because the totalisator is not the whole story. It is not even half of it. The Victoria Racing Club, which owns and operates Flemington, is a member-based not-for-profit. In its 2023 annual report, it disclosed total revenue of around $180 million across the Spring Carnival, with the Melbourne Cup Carnival's 4-day program drawing over 300,000 attendees. The club itself does not capture most of the wagering revenue. That flows to Tabcorp, to corporate bookmakers like Sportsbet and Ladbrokes, and ultimately through a complex set of product fees and race field charges back to Racing Victoria, the state-level governing body. Racing Victoria then redistributes this money to the broader thoroughbred industry. trainers, breeders, jockey welfare, regional racing clubs, and prize money pools. In other words, the Cup is the top of a funnel. A single race underwrites a year-round industry that, according to a 2019 IER report commissioned by Racing Australia, employs approximately 72,000 full-time equivalent workers nationally and contributes an estimated $9.1 billion in value added to the Australian economy each year. That is larger than the combined economic footprint of Australia's commercial fishing and aquaculture sectors. Therefore, the question is not why Australia stops for a horse race. The question is why this particular funnel evolved here and not in Britain, where modern thoroughbred racing originated, or in the United States, where the Kentucky Derby draws comparable global viewership. The answer lies in a piece of legislation passed in Victoria in 1961. That year, the state government legalized off-course betting through the creation of the Totalisator Agency Board, the original TAB. Before 1961, betting outside the racecourse itself was illegal across most of Australia, which meant a thriving network of illegal SP, or starting price. Bookmakers operated in pubs and back alleys in every Australian city. The Bland Royal Commission of 1959 to 1960 in New South Wales had estimated that illegal off-course wagering turnover exceeded legal on-course turnover by a factor of roughly 4 to 1. The state was losing enormous tax revenue to an informal economy it could not regulate. Victoria's solution was to create a state-owned monopoly betting agency with a network of retail outlets. New South Wales followed in 1964, Queensland in 1962. The result was that within a decade, every Australian capital city had a government-licensed betting shop on virtually every main street. The Melbourne Cup, already the most prestigious race on the calendar, became the single largest annual liquidity event for these networks. The tabs were eventually privatized. Victoria's tab was floated on the ASX in 1994. It later merged with Tabcorp Holdings, which today holds exclusive wagering licenses in Victoria, New South Wales, and several other jurisdictions. The privatisation moved a state monopoly into shareholder hands, but the legislative architecture that made the funnel possible remained. The Cup was no longer just a race. It was the keystone of a financial product distribution network. And this is the part most people miss. The genius of the Australian model is not the race itself. It is the regulatory geometry around it. A 2017 working paper from the University of Sydney's School of Economics, authored by Dr. Francis Markham and colleagues at Australian National University. The ANU analyzed gambling expenditure data from the Australian Gambling Statistics Series maintained by the Queensland Government Statistician's Office. The paper found that Australians lose more money per capita on legal gambling than the citizens of any other country on Earth. The 2022 figures put per adult gambling losses at approximately $1,400 Australian dollars annually, roughly double the per capita losses recorded in the United States. Racing accounts for around 15% of that figure, with the largest single-day spike occurring on the first Tuesday of November. The Cup, in other words, is not just a cultural event. It is the most efficient customer acquisition day in Australian financial services. On Melbourne Cup Day, the corporate bookmakers, Sportsbet, Ladbrokes, Bet365, and others run their largest advertising spends of the year. They offer first deposit bonuses, sign-up matches, and risk-free first bets specifically calibrated to convert casual once-a-year punters into recurring customers. According to data published by Nielsen and reported in the Australian Financial Review in late 2023, gambling advertising spend during the week of the Cup routinely exceeds $30 million across television, radio, and digital, more than triple the average weekly spend. The race lasts 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The customer relationship, if the conversion works, can last decades. This brings the story to the open loop teased at the start. The 2014 Victorian Government Report, formally titled The Size and Scope of the Victorian Racing Industry, prepared by IER-TY Limited for Racing Victoria, contained a figure that almost no one outside the industry has ever quoted. The report calculated that the racing industry's economic contribution to Victoria alone was approximately $2.8 billion in value added per year. That roughly 35% of that figure was directly attributable to activity generated within a 4-week window surrounding the Melbourne Cup Carnival. one race meeting, 1 month, 1/3 of a multi-billion-dollar annual industry. The mechanism finally is this. The Melbourne Cup is not a sporting event with a betting market attached. It is a betting market with a sporting event attached. The horses are the loss leader. The race is the storefront. The actual product is a wagering ecosystem that uses one nationally televised, legally enshrined cultural moment to harvest customer attention, convert casual interest into account signups, and then monetize those accounts across the remaining 364 days of the year. The public holiday is not a tribute to the race, it is the distribution channel. Once you see the structure, it explains everything else. It explains why the Victoria Racing Club fought so hard and successfully to keep the Cup on a Tuesday rather than moving it to a weekend. Because a weekday public holiday forces collective viewing and prevents competing leisure activities from fragmenting the audience. It explains why fashion, hospitality, and the famous trackside marquees are so heavily promoted by sponsors who have no direct connection to racing, because they expand the audience demographic well beyond traditional punters. It explains why every major Australian bank, airline, and retailer runs Cup Day promotions. Attaching to the event captures share of attention from a captive national audience, and it explains the most peculiar feature of all. In an era when sports betting is increasingly seen as a public health concern, when the Albanese government's 2023 inquiry led by the late Peter Murphy MP recommended a complete phased ban on gambling advertising, and when New Zealand, Britain, and several European countries have moved aggressively to restrict wagering promotion, the Melbourne Cup remains untouched. The race is too embedded, the funnel is too profitable, the cultural cover is too effective. A Productivity Commission inquiry in 2010 noted that gambling reform in Australia consistently founders on the same obstacle, the political impossibility of being seen to attack what voters perceive as a tradition rather than an industry. What Australia built, accidentally or otherwise, is the most successful regulatory shield in global gambling. A 3-minute race that converts a country into customers. A public holiday that doubles as a marketing event. A cultural institution that is, in functional terms, a piece of financial infrastructure. The race that stops a nation does not stop it for the horses. It stops it because the economic architecture surrounding the horses requires the nation to stop all at once, looking in the same direction, with their phones open and their accounts logged in. What the viewer has just understood is that some of the most powerful economic engines in a modern economy hide inside events that look on the surface like culture. They are not anomalies. They are designs. Every country has one or two of these structures where a beloved tradition turns out to be the front end of a sophisticated extraction system. And the more emotionally protected the tradition, the harder the system is to reform. Australia happens to have built the world's most efficient version around a horse race in Melbourne on a Tuesday in November that almost no one outside Australia has ever bet on. The next question is, what happens when the funnel finally breaks? And there is one Australian institution larger than the Cup with a similar structural dependency on a single annual event that is already showing the cracks. That institution is the Australian Football League Grand Final, and while it has not yet reached the gambling saturation of the Melbourne Cup, the structural pressures pushing it in that direction are now impossible to ignore. The AFL Grand Final, held on the last Saturday of September at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, draws around 100,000 spectators into the stadium and another 4 million Australian television viewers, which in a country of 26 million represents a share of attention that no scheduled broadcast in the United States, adjusted for population, has matched since the 1980s. The wagering turnover on the Grand Final has roughly tripled since 2015, climbing from approximately $140 million to more than $400 million in the most recent published figures. The league itself now derives a meaningful slice of its commercial revenue from official wagering partnerships, including a multi-year agreement with Sportsbet signed in 2018 and renewed on expanded terms in 2023. The cracks in this structure are already visible. In May of 2023, the federal parliamentary inquiry led by the late Labour MP Peter Murphy released a report titled You Win Some, You Lose More, which recommended a complete phase out of gambling advertising across all Australian media within 3 years. The report documented that Australians lose roughly $25 billion to legal gambling each year, the highest per capita losses on Earth, ahead of Singapore, Ireland, and the United States, and that the average adult Australian loses approximately $1,500 annually to gambling, with the figure climbing past $2,400 when only those who actually gamble are counted. The Murphy report named the Grand Final and the Melbourne Cup explicitly as the two events around which advertising saturation peaked. It argued that the cultural shielding of these events was not a reason to exempt them, but precisely the reason reform had to start with them. The government's response, delivered slowly and in fragments through 2024, did not adopt the full phase-out. It proposed instead a cap on advertisements, a ban on advertising 1 hour before. After live sport and the prohibition of gambling logos on player uniforms by 2026, industry lobbyists, including Responsible Wagering Australia, argued that an outright ban would push punters toward unregulated offshore operators, cost the federal treasury more than $900 million per year in lost wagering and GST revenue. Public health advocates, led by the Alliance for Gambling Reform and its chief advocate Tim Costello, countered that the offshore leakage argument had been used to defeat every meaningful reform since the early 2000s. That the actual offshore share of the Australian market, measured by the H2 Gambling Capital Consultancy, sat below 8%, had not meaningfully grown in jurisdictions that impose advertising restrictions, such as Italy in 2018 and Belgium in 2022. The deeper problem, and the reason the Grand Final's structural exposure matters more than the Cup's, is demographic. The Melbourne Cup audience skews older, with a median better age above 45, and its growth has plateaued since 2019. The AFL Grand Final audience skews younger, with the steepest growth in wagering accounts among men aged 18 to 34, the same cohort that public health researchers at the Australian Gambling Research Centre identify as carrying the highest rates of gambling-related harm, including suicide ideation, relationship breakdown, and bankruptcy. A 2022 study published in the journal Addiction found that Australian men under 35 who bet on AFL matches were 4 times more likely than non-bettors of the same age to report clinically significant gambling problems within 24 months of opening their first account. What this means is that the funnel, which the Melbourne Cup pioneered, the conversion of a cultural event into a once-a-year onboarding ramp for new gambling accounts, has been replicated and intensified around football, and the cohort being onboarded is the cohort least equipped, financially and neurologically, to absorb the losses. The Grand Final, in other words, is the Cup's successor, scaled up, aimed younger, and operating under the same regulatory shield of cultural protection, with a constituency of harmed Australians that is growing fast enough to make the political calculus, for the first time in 2 decades, genuinely uncertain